Several years ago, Games Workshop went ahead and screwed up what is probably their best miniature by making him carry his gun instead of having him mounted on his shoulders. Well, you know what? I'm going to fix that problem today, and to make them even more irritated, we're going to be using Blender and 3D printing. This video here is being supported by my current crowdfunding campaign for a set of 3 sci-fi military vehicles. More about this later. Now, in all seriousness, Games Workshop is not entirely hostile to 3D printed pieces. I'm actually reading from their Warhammer World frequently asked questions where it says, "Are 3D printed parts I've designed allowed?" Blah, 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 blah. If you've gone to the effort of designing and printing your own bespoke parts for your army, then these parts are indeed permitted at our events. So therefore, if you want to go ahead and modify your broadside like this to give them shoulder-mounted guns, you can do it, but you got to do the Blender work yourself. So today's video is not going to be necessarily a step-by-step from start to finish for Blender, but I want to introduce you into the workflow of some of the common things you need to use to actually build pieces like this. And for mechanical stuff, it's pretty darn simple. But where we're going to begin is not right in Blender, but I first want to sketch out what I want this final piece to look like, just so I have some thoughts down on, I guess in this case, a digital piece of paper, but you could really use a pencil and pen and draw it out on a piece of paper and scan it in your computer. Because by getting your ideas down on some format before you get into Blender, it's going to make that part of the 3D modeling process go a lot faster. So let me jump over here to Photoshop and I'll walk you through what I'm doing. I'm going to keep this particular aspect of this process kind of loose and just get a rough sketch so I know what components I'm going to be modeling, as well as their approximate positions on the miniature. I'm not actually going to go ahead and create a final detailed plan, and you can do that if you want. I've done that before for some things for Battletech when I built some terrain for that. And possibly if you're actually going to be handing off your design to someone else to do the miniature process, maybe you want to go ahead and get a much more detailed, kind of more formalized drawing at this point. But since I'm doing my own 3D modeling work, I'm good here with just using this sketch. And once I've got the side view down, I'm also going to go ahead and sketch out a top view, because with these two views here, this is enough for this type of miniature to be made inside Blender. If you got something even more complex, you may need to do a front and back view, but pretty much you really need a side view and a top view for a gun like this. This will work perfectly fine. And the other thing I do sometimes here is if there's some interesting parts, I'm going to maybe make a note of it by writing some actual words down and identifying where that is, so I have a little bit of extra piece of information when it comes to modeling time, knowing there's something special about this area that I really got to focus on. Since this railgun has to interface with the broadside miniature, I first got to start by partially assembling that miniature. We'll jump over to Blender in just a moment, but I want to take a quick look at one of the vehicles currently being offered in my crowdfunding campaign for a set of 3 sci-fi military 3D printable vehicles. This is the Archer multiple launch rocket system, and like the other vehicles in the set, it's designed to be printed on your standard FFF 3D printers with a minimal amount of support while getting a maximum amount of details for those type of printers. So if you're interested in this kind of sci-fi military vehicle kits, you can check out a link in the description below for my Coordinator Alliance 3D Printables Miniature Kickstarter. Alright, let's dive over to Blender, and if you don't have that, you can find that over at blender.org and download it there. Regardless of what version of Blender you have, everything we're using today should work alright. The commands in this aspect haven't changed very much in probably 10 years. It's been a while, which is a good thing sometimes. So alright, what you need to know for today's tutorial is how to add new objects to your scene, move them around, scale them, just basic stuff like that. How to jump into edit mode and do similar operations with the vertices that make up the objects. And then finally, you need to know how to use modifiers. In particular, the only one I'm using is the boolean modifier. So you can look some more details up about that. That is some 3D math stuff. And the one kind of little tricky thing I am working with is I'm taking a curve and turning that into a mesh. And the reason I'm doing that is so that the bottom of the railgun will be able to match the top of the broadside's sides, so that I can properly mount that miniature, or properly mount that gun to that miniature. And fun random fact, the Archer multiple launch rocket system and the other two vehicles in the set were all designed in Blender, pretty much using the techniques you're seeing today. Alright, I'm now inside Blender here, and what I want to do is bring in 2 copies of the image I just created in Photoshop. We'll worry about what the second one is later, but the first one I'm going to import here, so I'm looking down from the top onto the image. My next step is to actually size up my reference image to the correct size that I want the weapon to be. In this case, it's going to be about 59 millimeters long. For sizing purposes in Blender, each of those little tiny gray squares is 1 meter in Blender world. However, most slicer programs will interpret that little square as 1 millimeter. Therefore, I'm going to make the length of this railgun about 59 to 60 of those little squares, or approximately 6 of the bigger 10 by 10 boxes. And I'm pretty much going to start roughly building out what I see here with basic objects. Now, you don't really need to do a lot of complex modeling in Blender when it comes to work with mechanical things like railguns, like other types of firepower, battle suits. All this stuff can be done really simple by basically taking cubes and modifying them a little bit. Sometimes you bring in a cylinder if you want to make things interesting. But as you see here, I'm really just laying down a bunch of cubes and I'm scaling them to the right size and roughly getting them where I think they're going to go. And I'm only worrying about this view right now. And to add detail, I'm pretty much just taking more cubes and stacking them on top of the cubes that I already have. I am doing a little bit of vertex manipulation from here and there, where I'm adding some slants to the miniature to make some of the things look a little bit cooler, but that's just pressing tab to jump into edit mode, selecting some of the vertices, and then moving the vertices independent of another. It's another fairly straightforward process. For some aspects of the gun, for example, mainly the 3 things that kind of run down the barrel, I'm going to call them cooling vents, because I don't know what else to call them. If I have any weird detail that I don't know what to call it, I always call it a cooling vent or part of the cooling system, because it's just a good excuse. I'm going to model one completely with all the extra cubes attached to it. I kind of join it together as a single mesh. That's Control J when you select multiple objects. And then I can go ahead and duplicate it and move it out along the railgun to the rest of the spots where it may be. Now, this is where if you want to get fancy, you could use something called the array modifier to equally space these pieces out. That's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. It's not that hard, but I don't feel like going through the details of it. So I just kind of go ahead and eyeball it, and that looks good enough for this particular miniature. But if you were to have a lot of those things, like maybe 10, 20, 30 of them, the array modifier would be a good option. So once the entire miniature is built from this view, what I need to do is now swap to my top view and start kind of scaling and making pieces fit from that view. So when I swap to what is my top view of the miniature, if I haven't done so already, I'm going to go ahead and bring in one more copy of my reference image. I'm going to line it in such a way that it pretty much lines up more or less with how the pieces look from the top. And in this process, I'm kind of doing what I just did, but now I'm working with the top view. So it's a lot of going back in, scaling individual pieces, moving them around so they roughly match up with my design. Of course, I say roughly because once again, this was a simple sketch that I put together. It was not an exact, precise design. So things kind of go, you know, more or less where I think they look kind of cool. I've got the first kind of advanced operation coming up right here, and that's the Boolean modifier. Now, a modifier, as kind of the name suggests, it's a set of mathematical operations that modify an object. In this case, Boolean is a type of mathematical combination operation. So we're going to be using subtraction. So what I'm essentially doing is I'm taking my actual piece that I've got here that's kind of the, quote, muzzle brake, for lack of a better phrase, of the front of the railgun. And then I'm creating a second object, which is going to be used to cut out the space that's going to be kind of the barrel per se. And then I got to place that cutout piece in a manner that once that area is removed, it's going to look like how I want it to look. So I'm kind of sticking the lead piece and insetting it a little bit into the muzzle brake. Then I select the muzzle brake and I add a modifier that's a Boolean operation. I choose subtraction, and then I select the object that represents that piece that's in there that's going to get cut out. And then once I hit apply, if everything went all right, keyword everything went all right, sometimes these operations go askew. And unfortunately, when that happens, that's beyond the scope of this video. There's a lot of crazy stuff that can happen. Well, you should get something that looks where your muzzle brake now has a little bit of indent in it, kind of like the old school broadsides did. I'm going to get even more ambitious. Try that again by cutting in some side slots. Now, the caveat here is the more Boolean operations you do on an object, the better chance you have of Blender choking and dying. So just keep that in mind. The more fancy you get, the more things can go askew. But it's the same process. I'm creating some objects here to represent these two slots going to be cut out of it. And I'm going to go through that whole modifier process one more time. And there we can call this part of the miniature done. Now that I've got things sized up, there is one more tricky little aspect to do, and it's building the piece that interfaces the railgun with the shoulder of the broadside. And what I've done at this point here is I actually took a picture of the broadside with my phone such that I can see the slope of his shoulder there. And I'm going to use a curve inside Blender to match that slope. And there are tools that can allow you to take this curve and convert it to a mesh. Now, a mesh is your normal type of object with little vertices and things like that. And from there are a set of operations to fill it out to be a solid object. So it's extruding, using the face tool, and some of those things let you turn into a 3D shape that still has the slope of the shoulder of the broadside. And then I can go ahead and attach that to the bottom of the gun. And therefore, now I've got a nice interface between the broadside and this new railgun I just created. With the model basically complete, we got a few steps inside of Blender to wrap things up. First of all, I want to have you select all the objects that make up your railgun and join them together with Control-J. Then jump into edit mode with Tab, and you want to select all the vertices with the letter A. So all the dots that make up this object should be orange. Then you want to hold down Shift-N. This is recalculate normals. It's a magic Blender math thing that helps make your model a little bit friendlier when it comes to your slicer program. Then export as an STL file. Press Tab to jump back to object mode. Make sure your railgun is selected. And then go up to File, Export STL, and save it out to your computer wherever it may be. And from this point, you want to jump over to whatever slicer program you use for your resin printer, import it in there, add the supports as normal, and print it out. One final detail I should mention here with my railgun, it's asymmetrical, so when it comes to printing the left versus the right, I do have to flip the thing inside my slicer program. And with the magic of video editing, I've got my railguns done right here. Let's get them on the broadside. Now, back in the day, Games Workshop were stingy when it came to the bits they gave you in these kits. The broadside only had a single plasma rifle because it was basically a modified version of the Crisis Suit kit, which also only had one plasma rifle. So usually your broadside plasma rifles would be given to Crisis Suits to give them twin-link plasma weapons, when I really wanted also the broadsides to have them as well. Well, times have changed, and we got two in this kit. Time to kit bash these things onto this guy's arms. And with those arms and guns attached there, this is a miniature that is truly deserving of the legacy of the broadside, at least in my opinion, you know. I may be a bit biased with my own custom parts on there, but hey, hopefully you found this kind of introduction to the workflow of Blender for miniatures from games like Warhammer 40,000 quite useful. And I'm Jason, the creator of the Tabletop Battlefield. Thank you guys all for watching, and if you want to check out my crowdfunding campaign for the Coordinator Alliance miniatures, you can find a link to that down in the description below. Alright, I'll see you guys all next time.